How's it going, guys? My name's Nick and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can easily make Bob Ross styled pixel art just like those in my previous videos. So, without further ado, let's get into it. To start off, we need to talk about hardware and software. For hardware, I personally like working on my PC with a little Wacom drawing tablet, but you can easily use a mouse or work on a phone or tablet if you prefer. When it comes to software, there are many different programs out there that you can use, each with their own pros and cons. Personally, I like to use Aseprite, which is made for the exclusive purpose of making and animating pixel art, and it has all the tools you'd ever really need. It's available on Mac and PC via Steam, and costs about $20. There's also a free demo version if you're interested. On the more expensive end of things, there's Adobe Photoshop, which costs about $10 a month or $120 a year. While it is much more expensive, Photoshop has many more tools and effects to play around with. If you're serious about pixel art and open to trying larger scale digital art in the future, you can't really go wrong here. However, if you're just starting off and you're a little unsure as to whether or not you'll be making pixel art regularly, there are also plenty of free options out there, such as Piskel and Pixilart.com. Though I can't personally attest to how good they are, I've had friends say lots of good things about them. If you want to learn more about the different programs that are out there, I highly suggest checking out Brandon James Greer's video on the subject. He does a great job of showcasing and rating some of the more popular options. I'll be putting the link to his video, and links to everything I've mentioned thus far, down in the description box below. Next up is selecting a tutorial. Really, this part's up to you, but when you're just getting started, I recommend choosing one of Bob's simpler videos that have a clear foreground and background, and less emphasis on textures and details. This means avoiding ones with flowing water, complex skylines, and close, textured surfaces and structures. As I said though, it's really all a matter of personal preference. If you see one of his videos that you'd really like to try out, go for it. What's great about working digitally is that nothing's really permanent, so you can spend as much time as you want experimenting until you get something you're happy with. For the purposes of today's video, I'll be following along with Season 14, Episode 1, Distant Mountains. Before we start painting, there's one last thing I should note, and that's the color palette. For this, I found a pic online of the actual colors that Bob Ross used in his series. If you want to make your own color palette just as I did, first select a color by holding Alt and clicking. Then, click the red exclamation point under the color wheel. Once you have all the colors in your palette, you can go up to the top and hit Save Palette. You can call it whatever you want. And now you have a digital version of Bob Ross's palette. Now that you've got your equipment, your software, reference, and color palette, it's time to start painting. So for the rest of the video, I'm just going to be watching over this time-lapse footage that I've created and commenting over, trying to give some tips and tricks where I can. Alright, so I start off by creating a 180 by 240 pixel canvas. This is sort of to try and mirror the proportions of Bob Ross's canvas. In this video, he's using an 18-inch by 24-inch canvas. My general rule of thumb when making pixel art based on real life is to do 10 pixels per inch. So that's what I'm doing here. I then move on to creating the sky, which is the first thing that he does in every video. The way I do this, you can do this a number of ways, but the way I do it is by selecting a nice blue color, and then having choosing the gradient tool and setting the dithering to bare matrix 8x8, and then creating a nice gradient from the top to where the waterline's supposed to be, and it creates a really nice effect, I think. Okay, so next is the waterline. The way I do this is by using the gradient tool again, but having my first color be a lighter blue than the sky, and then having my second color be transparent, completely transparent. And the reason is I select a square area where I want the water to be. And by making that second one transparent, that allows me to make another layer on top of the first layer and make another gradient over it, as you see here. And that kind of gives the illusion that there's light hitting the water and coming towards you, which is a really nice effect. Okay, so next up is the clouds. Clouds are a little tricky, whereas in real life you can just sort of put them in, as he does, in less than a minute or so. There's a little more technique involved when you're doing it in Pixilart. What I found the easiest way to do it is choosing the circular brush and setting the size to about 4 or so, and then sort of going along and making these little puffy organic shapes. And once I'm satisfied with how I've done there, I go on to use the eraser and separate and kind of give the illusion that there are some clouds in front of others. Bob really doesn't do this next part, but I think it's a nice touch. You can also add a secondary color on top of your clouds. So if you want the whole piece to seem a little bit warmer, maybe it's a sunset or sunrise, you can add a little bit of pink over top and sort of highlight the top of it. Or if you want it to be a little cooler, you can add a little bit of blue. Totally up to you, it'll look just as good without it. Okay, so now that the clouds are done, it's time to start making some mountains. Personally, I think making mountains is actually easier here than when you're doing it in real life with a palette knife, because you really have a high degree of control, and you can redo something or erase if you don't like it. So now that I've painted a mountain, you need to put snow on the mountain. So if you want, you can just do these as solids like I do for the first step here, and the end result will look pretty decent. I like to do a little more detail. So what I do here is I select the background color, that initial brown color, and I kind of speckle in little details and things to kind of mirror what it would look like on a real canvas. This actually takes a really long time if you want to accurately reflect what he's doing. I think it took me around 45 minutes or so. But like I said, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. I should mention too, I actually separate everything by layers. Even if I want to make like minor adjustments, I'll duplicate the layer sometimes, just so I have a really good degree of control of everything. I can move layers independently from others. If I want to move the trees in the background but not the ones in the foreground, very easily do that. So now he starts putting in these far off trees, which I do by hand, by sort of making these little triangles of varying height and thicknesses. So you can actually save yourself some time by making your own custom tree brushes if you want, and you can do this by by drawing a little tree and then selecting it, and hitting Control and B at the same time, and that'll make you a little custom brush. But like I said, I like to do it by hand. I think it looks a little more organic that way. For the reflections for the trees, I just select the trees that I just made and copy and paste them in, and then flip them upside down. You can do this by just manually turning them 180 degrees, or you can hit Control and V and it'll flip it vertically for you. Then I go over and use the blur tool at a little over half opacity and run it over the trees until I get an effect that I'm really happy with. So now we start adding a little bit of grass in the background. Nothing really special here. You can kind of add as much detail as you want. You can use the brush or the airbrush tool if you want, doesn't really matter. Just make sure that the grass doesn't go too high or too low, or it'll sort of ruin the illusion that it's off in the distance. Again, I put some highlights on this grass to make it a little more lifelike, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So this is something that Bob doesn't really do either, but I like to add shadows and highlights to my trees. So you'll see this a lot in my videos, but anytime I'm shading something, I'll open up the color bar with HSB, it's hue, saturation, and brightness. I'll increase the saturation, decrease the brightness, and shift the hue slightly towards red or blue, depending on if I want it to be warmer or cooler. For highlights, I do the opposite. I'll decrease the saturation, increase the brightness, and hue shift towards yellow. Shout out to Pixilart for showing me how to do that. I'll be putting a link to his tutorial down in the description if you're interested. So for the water lines, I like to put little horizontal white lines in, and then go over it with the eraser set to a really low opacity, and sort of take out the harshness of those white lines, and add emphasis where I want. So you can add a little bit of more depth to your water lines that way. It's really easy. So now for the fun stuff, the big trees. My best advice to you when making pine trees is to kind of think of it like you're making a Christmas tree on a card or something. Make a really thin trunk as your base, start at the top, and then make little zigzag patterns as you go down, getting a little bit wider with each curve. And don't be afraid to have little stray branches and things like that too. It makes it look a lot more realistic that way. So for the close-up grass, I'll select the same color that I just used for the trees, and I'll use the airbrush tool set to a low scatter but high frequency. And you can see that up at the top, those two settings. And I'll just hold it in spots until it's nice and full with color and you can't really see the water behind it anymore. And then I'll move on to the next spot until I'm happy with how it looks. So coming back to the pine trees, I like to make my highlights for the close-up trees like I would color a Christmas tree. So just sort of like imagining where light would hit it, where it wouldn't, and making these little zigzaggy marks to make the tree look like it has needles. If you really want your trees to look good, you can also add a second highlight color, but you don't really have to if you don't want to. But you can also add little twigs and branches if you want. You can make your bushes look really, really good that way. Just adding little highlights, indications of what of little branches and twigs coming out from underneath. That can really add a lot to your painting. So for highlighting the grass, it's best to listen to what he has to say. He really likes preserving the darkness of the background and letting it stand out from the brightness in the foreground. That's very important. When you're creating the illusion of depth, is preserving the darkness in the back. So that's my best advice to you. Leave the dark in, and also mix up your colors a little bit. He'll usually say to mix with a sap green and a yellow ochre for the close-up colors. And when you're painting in real life, that will just naturally blend in with the colors that are already behind it. But that's not really how it works digitally. So I also recommend kind of adding slight variations in your color. Maybe adding a little bit more orange in some spots, a little bit more yellow, a little bit more green. So now he starts laying in a little pathway. And for him, it's very easy because he just sort of cuts across a mixture of colors of paint and smears it on like he did the mountain. And that only takes a couple seconds. But when you're doing it in Pixilart, it's a lot more involved. So you see me kind of go over it a couple times here, but I start with a base color, a really nice brown color, and then I start to add highlights in. At first I try adding that blue in like he did, and then kind of going over it with the blur tool, but that doesn't really look very good. So I decided to add another highlight to it, and then go over it with the darker color and add these little divots in the road where light isn't hitting it. And then I lighten the blue a little bit into a sort of gray color. And then here I am making more grass over top. And I start adding little twigs here and there, a little bit of darkness in the grass. And then I go over and do a second highlight color on the trees, as I said, which I think makes them look so much better. And then for my final touch, I just add this little branch jutting out over the water. add little highlights to it. And then I sign it. And that's it. Alright, so that was my tutorial on how to easily make Bob Ross style pixel art. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave a like and hit the subscribe button below. If you'd like, you can also follow me on Instagram. I keep my DMs open and I'd love to see you guys' pixel artwork. Anyways, that's it from me. Thank you all for watching and have a good one.